Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. We're just going to give it a few seconds here to allow people to arrive into our audience. Great. Well, good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar, our presentation on lithium-ion battery materials for EVs and their global value chains. My name is Adina Renee Adler. I'm Deputy Executive Director of Silverado Policy Accelerator. Silverado is a nonprofit bipartisan policy organization dedicated to solving geopolitical challenges in three critical national security areas of trade and industrial security, the intersection between economic and ecological security, what we call here Eco2Sec, and cybersecurity. Our novel policy accelerator model is designed to transform fresh ideas into actionable initiatives from the ground up. Today's webinar arguably touches all of Silverado's policy areas, but we are going to be taking a deep dive today on the supply chain scenarios for several key critical minerals used in electric vehicle batteries. So this really falls squarely in our trade and industrial security pillar, because we all are collectively seized with the question of how are we going to secure supplies for everything that we need for the green energy transition, including the deployment of electric vehicles, not to mention all the materials that we need for semiconductors, information technology, defense applications, et cetera, all competing with each other. We are so lucky to have in our government the U.S. International Trade Commission, or ITC, to help policymakers and the general policy community come to terms with what is within the realm of possibility. So this discussion is just as much about sharing that knowledge and their knowledge and expertise from a group of truly committed civil servants as it is in discussing the important issue of critical minerals. So let's dive right in. Today, I am joined by Andy David, Silverado's Senior Director of Research and Analysis. Andy joined Silverado last year after 14 years at the ITC, where he authored or co-authored numerous papers and reports on advanced technology products, environmental goods, renewable energy equipment, et cetera. I'm also joined by Sarah Scott, Senior International Economist at the U.S. International Trade Commission. Sarah works on issues ranging from wood products to electric vehicle value chains, and she also has many years of government experience under her belt. She will take over the mic in a moment to introduce her ITC colleagues and to get us started with a market overview. I would like to note that we will pause after each individual material presentation for a short Q&A that Andy will moderate, but we encourage you to please submit questions in the Q&A or chat box, and we will do our best to get to as many as we can. So let's get started, and I pass it over to you, Sarah. And don't forget to unmute yourself, Sarah.
Hi, sorry. Thank you. Hopefully the slides are up. So hello, everyone, and thank you to Silverado for inviting us here today to present our research on this important topic. For the benefit of those who aren't familiar with the USITC, we are an independent, nonpartisan, quasi-judicial federal agency that fulfills a range of trade-related mandates. Like Adina said, we provide high quality, leading edge analysis of international trade issues to the President and to the Congress. The Commission also performs research into important issues such as this one. This research team has been working on understanding the global value chains of materials that make up lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles for the past several years. We have published several working papers on this topic, 1 overview papers, and 3 papers that each concentrate on lithium, cobalt, and graphite. We have another on nickel that is forthcoming. This presentation uses the most up-to-date and dependable publicly available information. For example, trade data are not fully available for 2022 until later this year. So we provide analysis using the 2021 data. So if you see any data that aren't from more recent, it's because it's not available. So I'm Sarah Scott, and I'm presenting, and our presentation team includes Anna Perry, Kristen Smith, David Guberman, and Carl Suji. And today's presentation will start with a brief introduction, and then our team will discuss lithium, cobalt, nickel, and graphite in turn. But let me first give you a little bit about how lithium-ion batteries work. So the lithium-ion batteries power everyday devices such as laptops and cell phones and electric cars. They are lightweight, they have high energy density, meaning that they can store a relatively large amount of energy in a small amount of mass, and they are rechargeable. A lithium-ion battery uses an anode, which is the negative electrode, a cathode, which is the positive electrode, and an electrolyte as a conductor. The electrode is what enables charged ions to flow between the two electrodes. There's also a semi-permeable layer that keeps everything separate so that the reaction can be controlled. A lithium-ion battery uses lithium ions as the key component of its electrochemistry, which is how the battery gets its name. Lithium-ion batteries can be used in use a number of different materials, and these batteries, of course, use lithium, and the common combinations use cobalt and nickel as the cathode and graphite in the anode and electrolyte. And experimenting with cathode and anode materials allows manufacturers to strengthen some qualities, but may compromise others. If you take a look at the image, the battery works as the electrolyte carries positively charged lithium ions from the anode to the cathode through the separator. This process is called a reduction-oxidation reaction. Oxidation is where the material loses electrons, and reduction is when it accepts electrons. The expected growth in electric vehicle or EV sales has led to increasing concern about securing material inputs used in their batteries. EV sales broke new records, with nearly 10% of 2021 global car sales being electric, which was 4 times their market share in 2019. 5 times more EV batteries were available. EV models were available in 2021 relative to 2015, and most major car makers are increasingly adding EVs to their available stocks. Batteries typically account for 30 to 40% of the value of an EV. For relative importance, the cathode materials, lithium, cobalt, and nickel, which determine the capacity and power of a battery, account for about 50% of an EV battery cell cost, and about 12% of the cell cost is accounted for by the anode material, which is graphite. The current EV battery chemistries depend on several critical minerals whose domestic supply is potentially at risk for disruption. The USGS designated these minerals as critical. China accounted for half the growth of the EV market in 2021. The largest EV battery manufacturers are all headquartered in Asia, and about 80% of all cell manufacturing occurs in China. There have been some recent government actions in the US that are also impacting and acknowledging the importance of this market. And just to name a few, there was the executive order called America's Supply Chains, which ordered a review of the vulnerabilities of our critical mineral and material supply chains within the current administration's first 100 days. A supply chain assessment was released that found US over-reliance on foreign sources and adversarial nations for critical minerals. Then there was the Federal Consortium for Advanced Batteries. They released the national blueprint for lithium batteries, and this codified the findings of the battery supply chain review. This was part of the whole of government plan to develop a domestic lithium battery supply chain. The Infrastructure Act established the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program, which provides about $7.5 billion to develop the country's EV charging infrastructure. And that goal is to install 500,000 public chargers nationwide by 2030. The Minerals Security Partnership, or the MSP, is a working group of friendly countries that focus on critical minerals that are inputs for electric vehicles and advanced batteries. It provides a forum for information sharing and the potential funding for projects, though no major initiatives have been announced yet. The U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, amended the Clean Vehicle Credit and added a new requirement for final assembly in North America that took effect in August of 2022. Many U.S. trade partners, including those in the MSP, have raised concerns that the tax credits for new electric vehicles, along with their batteries, composed of critical materials like lithium, nickel, and cobalt, are extracted, processed, or recycled in the U.S. or by the nation's free trade agreement partners. For example, the UK, the EU, South Korea, and Japan have all mentioned that the EV tax credit contained in the IRA puts foreign automakers at a competitive disadvantage and violates World Trade Organization rules. The US and several important trade partners are now working toward agreement on the details, such as the deal that in the works with the EU to make European minerals eligible for tax credits, which was announced on Friday. And that was just to look into it, not an actual deal. So here is some EV demand information. And even in the midst of the pandemic and associated global supply chain challenges, including the semiconductor chip shortages, sales of electric cars reached a record high in 2021. This market nearly doubled year on year to $6.6 million of sales in that same year. This brought the total number of electric cars on roads to about 16.5 million. This is in contrast to there being about 1.4 billion cars on the earth. So most of them are not EVs. As I mentioned a bit earlier, China dominates this market, and sales were highest in China, where they tripled relative to 2020. Together, China and Europe accounted for more than 85% of global electric car sales. Sales in the US more than doubled from 2020 to reach 630,000. This global growth comes with the strengthening of policy support for EV markets, such as the tightening of the CO2 emission standards and expansion of purchase subsidies and tax benefits. And some of the main drivers around the growth in the United States in 2021 were in response to pent-up demand. This was met by the availability of a new generation of EV models by automakers in general and the increased production of Tesla models. Looking forward, the IEA indicates that EVs will represent more than 30% of vehicles sold globally in 2030 across all modes. The most commonly used varieties of cell formulas are the LMO, NMC, LFP, and NCA, and this slide shows their compositions. While lithium iron phosphate, or LFP batteries, have previously been sidelined in favor of other cell formulations, this may be changing amongst EV makers. For example, Tesla announced in late 2021 that the company plans to transition to LFP batteries in all its standard range vehicles. And Ford is building a new LFP plant in Michigan, and LFP usage is expected to grow in the United States, but not likely to replace the NCMs. There is also research in the works to shift to other chemistries such as sodium-ion or lithium-sulfur battery cells in the hope that they could be up to 2/3 cheaper than today's lithium-ion cells. These battery chemistries have problems that would require some breakthroughs. For instance, sodium-ion batteries don't store enough energy, while sulfur cells tend to corrode quickly and don't last as long. As EV batteries prices keep dropping, the global supply of EVs and demand for their batteries is ramping up. This graph illustrates that since 2015, the average price of an EV battery pack has fallen, but the prices of critical minerals are on the rise. The growth of the industry is dependent upon the security of supply for these critical materials. As prices rise for certain minerals, cathode chemistries are expected to shift towards differing mineral-intensive options.
Thanks, Sarah. That was a really interesting presentation. One question to start us off. You had shown the chart of the EV sales by country, and it was really interesting how quickly China has grown and how fast their EV sales have grown. I wonder if you can give us a little sense for why EV sales are growing so quickly in China.
So I went back to slide 5 because that's the one that you were referring to. And I would say that China's national government has long played an important role. They propped up both the supply of EVs and the demand for them. In the 2000s, China was a powerhouse in manufacturing traditional internal combustion cars, but there were no domestic brands that could one day rival the foreign car makers that dominate this market. Rather than compete with established international brands, the Chinese government chose to invest in EVs. And for China, EVs also had the potential to solve some other problems they were having, like curbing its severe air pollution, reducing its reliance on imported oil, and helping to rebuild the economy after the financial crisis in 2008. Then the Chinese government took steps to invest in related technologies as early as 2001. EV technology was introduced as a primary science research project in China's 5-year plan. And then in about 2007, a man named Wang Zhang, who is an auto engineer that worked for Audi for more than a decade, became China's Minister of Science and Technology. And he's credited with making the national decision to go all in on electric vehicles. Since then, the EV development has been consistently prioritized in China's national economic planning. China has been very generous with subsidies, tax breaks, procurement contracts, other policy incentives for EV manufacturing and purchases for more than a decade now. However, the national subsidies that started in 2009 have ended. They ended in December of 2022. And the size of the subsidies were steadily reduced over time with cuts over the last several years. For example, the subsidy contributed about 35% of an EV price in 2017 and only 10% in 2022. But while the subsidy policy officially ended at the end of last year, there's now a more market-oriented and pretty complicated system called dual credits. They introduced it in actually 2017, and they adapted it from a state of California law. Basically, the dual credit policy punishes production of fossil fuel cars and rewards the production of EVs. It's been a pretty successful policy in incentivizing EV production. In fact, some Chinese companies are even selling EVs below cost, as long as the revenue from selling carbon credits can make up for the shortfall. Their auto market is also reliant on various incentives from local governments. For example, Shanghai has a rebate for those who exchange their oil cars for electric ones. And in addition, just as the rubber hits the road type thing, China is the world's largest auto market. So it kind of makes sense that China's consumption of EVs would be the largest in absolute value. But Europe actually exceeds China in EV sales in the share of their new auto sales.
Actually, that last point is really interesting, Sarah. So thank you so much for sharing that. So we're going to turn to Sarah's colleague, Anna Perry, to present on lithium. Anna is an international economist with over 6 years of expertise in natural resource and energy economics. And so I know we're all ready to hear what she has to say on lithium.
Thank you, Adina. Okay, so the first critical material we'll cover here is lithium. It's a major component in both the cathodes and electrolytic solutions of lithium-ion batteries, and it's essential in enabling the battery to charge. As an element, its properties make it pretty perfect for battery use. It's simultaneously very light, energy dense, and highly reactive. Lithium deposits are actually relatively abundant and widely distributed, but they tend to exist in low concentrations, which require intensive processing. And so historically, only a subset of deposits have been candidates for profitable extraction. As such, there's a lot of incentive to fund research into alternatives to lithium. It's both costly and environmentally damaging to extract. Sodium, as Sarah mentioned, is one compelling alternative. It's about 1,000 times more abundant than lithium. And CATL, the world's largest battery producer, has announced mass production of sodium-ion batteries beginning this year. But sodium is less energy dense than lithium and less consistent in its charging and discharge cycles. So it's expected it might be more suitable for grid scale energy storage rather than EVs. So nothing yet has been proven to be able to commercially and competitively replace lithium as an input for EV batteries. Next, please. So here we have a process flow for the lithium supply chain, and you'll see a similar version of this for each of our critical materials. The major production steps in extracting and processing lithium reveal several key players in the global value chain. And those are noted above each step, along with the harmonized tariff codes used to identify each form of lithium in global trade data. Currently, extraction comes from two sources, either from ores or brine extraction. The ore extraction is the more conventional, energy-intensive mining that can be set up on a quicker timetable, while brine extraction historically relies on evaporation from the sun in salt ponds. So ore mining is heavily concentrated in just two Australian operations. One is the Greenbushes mine, which has accounted for a huge portion of global lithium production in the last decade, while brine extraction largely occurs in four major operations in Chile and Argentina. And you'll notice on the bottom left here, lithium brine does not have its own HS code, and that is because the output from that production needs to be processed rather quickly and close by, so it's not widely traded internationally. The processing ores yield isolated lithium hydroxide, which is the favored lithium chemical for EV batteries, and most of that processing occurs in China. Ores can also be used to produce lithium carbonate, but more commonly, lithium carbonate is produced from brine extraction, and most of that processing occurs in Chile. But after the initial downstream processing in blue, lithium carbonate and hydroxide are input to produce chlorides, metals, and other fluorides in the orange here, categorized as refined lithium compounds. And so this processing is concentrated in China, South Korea, and Japan, and that's the stage where we see most of the value add occurring for lithium in EV batteries, which are assembled in the same countries, China, South Korea, Japan, along with the US and Western Europe. So these major downstream processors and refiners tend to consume those compounds domestically in their EV markets, and there's not as much export relative to production by this stage. Next. So looking at production here, which accounts for the first stage of the process flow we just walked through, Australia and Chile account for most of the production through ore and brine extraction, respectively. But you can see China in red here has been increasing its own lithium ore extraction in recent years. And on the right, we have the most recent estimates from USGS for reserves by country, with Chile and Australia having, again, the largest share of economically viable reserves for lithium. In terms of lithium resource identified deposits, which may or may not be commercially viable, Bolivia comes out on top with 21 million tons, followed by Argentina having 19 million tons. And some of you may have heard, I think just last week, news came out of Iran that they've discovered the second largest lithium deposit in the world, holding 8.5 million tons. But the quality of that deposit and potential for production and export is still a question mark. And US production in this chart on the left is withheld because there's currently only one active site in Silver Peak, Nevada. And that's operated by one of the world's largest lithium producers, Albemarle, who owns operations in South America and Australia as well. Next. So looking at consumption on the right, growth in lithium demand is fueled almost entirely from EV demand, and EV battery as a portion of lithium's projected end use is projected to rise from 39% in 2020 to 83% by 2030. And some projections even show that at 95% by 2030. Electric vehicle demand has already pushed the spot price for lithium chemicals up significantly in the last 2 years. There was a marked 1,000% increase in the price of lithium from the start of 2021 to November 2022, when lithium carbonate reached an all-time high of more than $80,000 per ton. And besides EV growth and incentives in developed countries for EV purchase, the price spike was fueled somewhat by increasing production costs in the past few years as well. But you'll see at the edge of this graph on the left, the 30%, there's been a 30% drop off from the all-time high in November and into the first quarter of 2023. And that's partly due to slower demand in China's electric vehicle sector, where some incentives, as Sarah had noted, for purchasing EVs expired at the end of 2022. Next. And here we have a 2021 snapshot of global lithium trade, which reflects the major players in the global supply chain that we've already discussed. And this shows two dominant bilateral trade flows for the mineral. The first being exports of unprocessed lithium ores from Australia in purple to China in red for processing and refinement. And the other being Chile's exports in light yellow on the left to downstream producers, including China, Japan, and South Korea, who tend to consume those inputs domestically for battery assembly and EV manufacturing. Next, thank you. While global demand is expected to continue growing each year through the end of the decade, it's expected that supply can catch up by 2030, but the market for lithium will continue to remain tight. The IRA has some major implications for lithium-ion battery components, including both lithium carbonate and lithium hydroxide, with benefits that would include separate tax credits for mining, refining, and battery assembly. So we're already seeing the impact of these incentives with announcements of quite a few downstream processing facilities in the US and a draw for more vertically integrated production that can capture some of these compounding benefits offered from the IRA. North American capacity is growing pretty substantially, looking ahead with several major extraction and processing sites slated to ramp up by 2025 to 2026. And some experts predicting that North America will supply about 10% of lithium globally by 2030. Direct lithium extraction, or DLE, technologies have the potential to shake up the production space further. And there are quite a few companies, both established lithium producers and emerging startups, that are working on some proprietary technologies and patents. but it's yet to be seen what will end up as winners and commercially scalable. And finally, there's battery metal recycling is becoming an increasing focus in the supply chain. And one example is Redwood Materials in the US, which has recently received a $2 billion loan from the DOE to expand its battery recycling facility outside Reno, Nevada. And so that operation takes end-of-life batteries to produce anode copper foil and cathode materials for new EV batteries. And I'll take some questions.
Thanks, Anna. That was a really interesting presentation. I'm really struck by the second slide you did, which had the process flow. And I know there's a lot of different lithium chemicals and lithium products and things like that. But looking at the top part in the middle, where China is really the main producer of those lithium hydroxide chemicals, there's been a lot of interest in like building supply chains outside of China, having other processing locations. Are there competitive advantages that China has in those lithium chemicals and that lithium hydroxide, or is it really just that that's kind of historically where the industry has kind of grown? Can you give us a little bit more context around that?
Yeah, I think historically it's more of a concern than it will be going forward. China currently controls about 2/3 of the global capacity for lithium refining into battery-ready chemicals. So no one country is currently able to compete with China in terms of the downstream supply chain and battery manufacturing more broadly. But its competitive advantage is really more in its existing vertical integration from the raw stage 2 chemicals to up through EV production, essentially, and the fact that it's able to capture all that value add in supply chain with its weakest point in the raw stage 1 materials. And as I noted, they are expanding operations there as well. But in terms of scalable production for lithium hydroxide, we're seeing so much capacity being built domestically and with friendly trading partners that I think the floodgates are kind of open for lithium hydroxide processing. And the historic edge China may have had in lithium hydroxide specifically is that it was sourcing from lithium ores in Australia, which, as noted in this flow that you mentioned, it's able to kind of skip the step of transitioning lithium carbonate to lithium hydroxide. So there was a cost advantage there, but that cost differential is not quite as consequential now that the market prices for lithium are so high. So it's kind of lost that edge when it comes to lithium hydroxide being produced directly from ores versus converted from lithium carbonate. So even though we're looking at more like 2025, 2026 for domestic capacity starting up here, I think we'll start to see the 2/3 of that refining share in China globally start to come down gradually.
Also very interesting. So thanks, Anna, for that. So turning now to the cobalt story, we have a 10-year economics veteran having worked for the Bureau of Labor Statistics as well as the ITC. So Kristen Smith, it's up to you now. We can't hear you, Kristen. Kristen, we can't hear you. I know you're unmuted. May just need to recheck your microphone. Sure.
Is this any better? Can you hear me now?
Great. Yep. Thank you so much.
Microphone to the rescue. No worries. So cobalt is mined primarily as a byproduct of extracting nickel and copper. Its leading use is in rechargeable battery electrodes, and it's prized because it's more temperature stable than high nickel battery chemistries. So it makes the battery more wear resistant over time. These batteries go through so many temperature cycles when they're charging and then discharging. And then cobalt can also store and transfer more energy than other materials. That's what they mean when they say it's more energy dense. So most people right now believe that there's no true replacement for cobalt that keeps the same high performance stability and energy density of a cobalt containing chemistry. But you'll often see headlines coming from researchers who say that they are getting close. Next slide, please. This is an overview of the process flow for cobalt, which Anna has already given you an example of one time. So starting on the left, most cobalt ores and concentrates are mined as byproducts from nickel and copper mines. Most cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the DRC, which I'll talk more about in a couple slides. They undergo a little bit of cleaning processing there, and then they are shipped to China. If we follow the path on the top of this graph here, they are refined into cobalt oxides and hydroxides, which are then used for battery cathodes in the major electronics manufacturing countries, China, Japan, South Korea. The cathode is then assembled into the battery. Otherwise, along the bottom path, ores and concentrates are processed into a cobalt matte or metal and used in a wide variety of applications, such as tool materials, catalysts, pigments, magnets, and soap and dryers. And all of these products can be recycled at the end of their lifetime to try and recover some of this cobalt to go through the life cycle again. So how have these applications impacted demand in the recent past? Let's look at the next slide. This graph shows demand for cobalt over the last several years. The years are lined up along the x-axis, and the bars show demand in kilotons, and the line shows year-over-year growth. 2021 is actually the first time that cobalt demand from EVs overtook all other battery applications to become the largest end-use sector for cobalt. Cobalt-containing batteries are also used in batteries for many small electronics, like our cell phones, our laptops, power tools, and electric bikes and scooters in different cobalt-containing chemistries of various amounts. Next slide, please. This graph shows world mine production over the last 5 years. Each country in the bar is a different color. The DRC is there in blue. And as you can see, it produces around 3/4 of the world's cobalt in any given year. And the increases in the last few years are almost entirely driven by them. China owns the vast majority of DRC cobalt mines, and so that material is sent directly to China. Between 12 and 20% of the DRC output is from artisanal and small-scale mining, a category that includes smaller legitimate domestic mines that might be locally owned, as well as outright illegal mining, either on land that is not designated for mining or by illegally stealing from the Chinese-owned mines. China uses all that cobalt ore to take its place as the largest refined cobalt producer, providing around 70% of 2021 refined supply. Let's take a look at some refined cobalt trade data to illustrate this story. So before I get into the trade numbers on this graph, let me say that official statistics in the trade of cobalt ore and intermediate unwrought cobalt have some issues. Trade numbers on cobalt ore out of the DRC, as well as cobalt ore into China, drop off after 2018. And my guess is that much of this trade has been classified as confidential in the official trade statistics. So we can only see that overall trade from the DRC to China has gone up. Intermediate unwrought cobalt trade statistics actually often contain material that is largely nickel, and so it's not always illustrative of the underlying cobalt trade. But these numbers here on the slide are trade in processed cobalt oxides. So China in blue on the left graph imports most of the ore produced in the DRC. It processes that ore and then becomes a large exporter of cobalt oxides. South Korea is the largest importer, turning that cobalt into batteries for various applications. There's also trade in Belgium, which has a long history of being a refiner of cobalt since at least the 1960s. Next slide. To chat about some recent developments in this space, there is a changing market equilibrium for cobalt. Cobalt demand is actually expected to continue rising rapidly as the EV transition gains supply, even with these new chemistries. And supply should keep pace with demand in the short term. Starting next year, the market is forecast to shift back into a deficit as supply growth fails to keep pace with demand. The price of cobalt for now has come down from its 2022 highs. Supply is highly dependent on the demand for nickel and copper. Sarah mentioned the Mineral Security Partnership, which could open new avenues for using taxpayer money to fund mineral projects in other countries. And the cobalt was a critical mineral targeted in the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act for investment to improve supply chains for EVs. Processing facilities are easier to build than mining outfits, and material processed in a processing facility is included as the bill as something that allows your vehicle to get the subsidies. So it's more likely that we'll see a build out of processing facilities in North America or among our trade partners rather than new cobalt mining activity. In North America, there is currently only one EV battery grade refiner, and that's Electra out of Canada. And they are already looking to build out a second refinery. They're also in talks with companies who have mining stakes in the aptly named Cobalt Ontario to potentially open new cobalt mines there. And speaking of new cobalt mines, we actually have a new small cobalt mine that just opened in Idaho. It's currently the only large-scale cobalt mining operation in the US. It's expected to produce enough cobalt for about 10% of overall US demand, but it will ship all of that cobalt to Brazil to be refined, as it's estimated to have only a 7-year supply, which doesn't make it worth it to build its own refinery. A small amount of cobalt comes from a Michigan nickel mine, and there's also a pilot project in Missouri to try to produce cobalt as well. And that's the end of my spiel, and I'll answer any questions that you have.
Thanks, Kristen. That's really interesting. Your chart on world mine production was really kind of, we know the DRC is the major supplier, but when we really see it on the page, it really jumps out about how much of the supply they dominate. Are there other potential sources of supply that can be scaled up outside the DRC as we go forward? Is the DRC kind of going to remain the main source, or are there other suppliers coming online?
Sure. So to answer that question, first let me highlight that the reason that we do have to look outside the DRC is because China owns most of that mining activity. And although there has been a rising movement from the DRC to have more of a say in how that mining activity is run and whether they can refine more of it themselves inside the DRC, we don't have any cobalt refining capacity here, so there's no way for us to attract cobalt ore from there or anywhere anyway. So Canada and Australia are better prospects for the raw material, and Indonesia actually is gaining traction as possibly a major player in cobalt. Canada, as mentioned, has the company Electra, who could refine material, and Finland has been building out more refining capability as well. But really where analysts see the greatest potential to shore up our supply chain is by producing the metal through the recycling of batteries and production scrap and waste.
That's really interesting, and it's really interesting to talk about Canada and Australia. I mean, you talked a little bit in your presentation as well about the new mines coming on in the U.S. Are there other reserves in the U.S. that could be utilized, and are there companies coming in to kind of look at building additional cobalt mines beyond kind of the new ones that you talked about coming online? The new one
Sure.
that you mentioned is coming online. Yeah.
Yes. Well, so cobalt worldwide is generally very plentiful, but unfortunately, we did not get the most of that in the United States. So the Geological Survey estimates that we have only about 69,000 tons that can be what they call economically extracted or produced. And that's compared to 3.5 million tons in the DRC. But there are a few companies that are looking into mining projects, and Idaho is the major focus there. Those companies are Jervois, Glencore, Electra, as previously mentioned, and US Strategic Metals. So they have mining projects in various stages of development in the US. And in Missouri, US Strategic Metals has this pilot facility that they say is capable of producing a little bit of battery grade cobalt via recycling, as well as mine waste from their nickel and copper mine and raw ore. But it's unclear what kind of commercial volume they would really be able to produce. The US government is also actively working to try and streamline the permitting process for any of these new mining activities.
That's great, Kristen. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. So let's shift over now to the story on nickel. And we're going to draw on David Guberman's more than 20 years of experience with the USGS and the ITC to tell us that story. David, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm going to start discussing nickel and our research that's ongoing. So nickel has become a very important mineral used in lithium-ion batteries over the last several years in the cathode in a lot of lithium-ion battery chemistries. The nickel improves energy density and increases the power and range of the vehicle that the battery is used in. So you have nickel in the nickel cobalt manganese and nickel cobalt aluminum chemistries that have become fairly common. And there's when you look at nickel overall, there are different types of nickel, and not all nickel, this is something that is important to understand initially, is not all nickel can be used in lithium-ion batteries. There's different classes of nickel. So looking at, when we study trade flows and track nickel movement, we look at the different nickel products, and you see here the broadly different categorized nickel products. There's unprocessed nickel, which is contained in ore and concentrates. Then there's an assortment of intermediate nickel products that have become increasingly important, especially for lithium-ion batteries over the last few years, as they've been started to become used in making nickel chemicals for batteries. Those are different things like mixed hydroxide precipitates and mixed sulfide precipitates. And in terms of final refined nickel products, you have a class 1 nickel, which is a high purity nickel metal, which is the type of nickel that's traded on the London Metal Exchange, and that's what is typically used for like the global nickel pricing. The benchmark pricing is based on the high purity 99% plus pure nickel. And the class 2 nickel products, such as ferronickel and nickel pig iron, which is a lower grade version of ferronickel, those are used in stainless steel, and those aren't applicable for use in lithium-ion batteries. Another material containing nickel that is important when you're looking at batteries supply chains is the chemical form nickel sulfate, which is about 22% nickel, and that's the form of nickel that's used in cathodes, as cathode materials for lithium-ion batteries. You see on the right side of the chart nickel consumption by the different major areas, the different applications. So the story of nickel is that it's primarily still used in stainless steel along with alloys. That accounts for the majority of global nickel usage, as has been the case for a long time. With batteries now, the estimates of around that 9% area range, and that includes all battery usage, not just lithium-ion batteries. Of course, it could be nickel-cadmium batteries and things like that. But that's the area that's where you see all the forecasts of nickel usage jumping. Over the next 10 to 15 years, the expectations are that piece of the pie will expand greatly, whereas the stainless steel may grow. It may grow, but not to the extent of the battery segments. Next slide, please. So I have my the material flow charts. These are simplified, showing nickel processing for the two different types of deposits. We have on the left side the laterite. These are surface level deposits that are found in tropical and subtropical regions. A lot of them are in Southeast Asia. So along with Australia, which has both types of deposits, but predominantly the laterite deposits are in areas like Indonesia, New Caledonia, Philippines. And these nickel deposits can be processed through different means, either pyro or hydrometallurgical techniques to derive the nickel products from the ore. And a lot of the processing is done in Indonesia and China for these laterites, along with the Philippines, which is growing. But the end product is typically, the majority of the end products for these laterite deposits are class 2 nickel products that are using stainless steel, and that's taking place in China and Indonesia. But then you have the intermediates, such as matte and these mixed precipitates that go into a nickel sulfate. And the nickel sulfates, that industry is primarily developed in Asia, China, Japan, Korea, and then Australia is now have some new projects coming on stream. But in the last few years, China in particular has the advantage because they've been an early adopter. And then when you look at the right side, these are the underground sulfide deposits. These are higher grade, and these are what you find in Australia, Canada, China, Russia, South Africa. They're high grade concentrates with more nickel content. They're processed through smelting and refining techniques, and these concentrates are what are used to produce the high grade class 1 nickel, which can be dissolved into nickel sulfate as well. And that's been the kind of the common production route for nickel sulfate is to use the class 1 nickel. But we're seeing now that as the demand is increasing, it's important to keep in mind that the nickel sulfate can be produced from various feed sources using different production routes, and it can be made from either directly or indirectly from intermediates as well as the class 1 nickel products. So there's a lot of different methods to getting the ultimate end product that's used in batteries, and the distribution of these. Actually, let's go on to the next slide, please. The next slide shows you on a global basis how the deposits are where they're found. This is not you're not really seeing the order of magnitude of these deposits, but just the countries. But in the blue are the underground high grade sulfide deposits. And most of these deposits are known, and that material is being extracted currently, and there aren't a lot of projects in the near future for developing new underground nickel sulfide deposits. It's the dark colors, the laterite deposits that you see in Philippines, Indonesia, New Caledonia, Brazil. These are the ones these are about 60% of the known global deposits versus 40% for the sulfide. And these are the areas where there's expectations for more nickel in the future. In terms of the proven nickel reserves on a global basis, Indonesia, Australia, New Caledonia, Brazil, Russia, and Philippines are the leading countries. Next slide, please. Taking a look at nickel production and consumption, you see that on the mine production side, the gray is Indonesia. So Indonesia's been, for the last several years, the leading mining producer of nickel, followed by a bunch of other large but smaller compared to Indonesia producers such as Russia, Australia, Canada, and Philippines. And then on the right side is the processing of nickel into both. This is the content of nickel contained in either class 1 or class 2. It's total. And you see also here the gray in Indonesia has expanded significantly. And that's because, and we're going to discuss a little bit in a couple slides, but Indonesia has the government has taken an interest in propping up the downstream nickel production, and they've banned exports of nickel concentrates. So they've, in hopes of building their downstream industry specifically for steel and lithium-ion batteries. We'll get back to that in a minute, but I do want to point out here, you see on both sides of this slide, you don't have U.S. mine production showing up. There is one operating mine. It's in Michigan, and it's scheduled to close in 2026. It's a relatively small nickel mine, and we don't have any domestic refinery production in the United States currently for nickel. So all the mine production is exported to Canada primarily. So that kind of highlights where the U.S. stands in terms of nickel that it needs. It's reliant on other sources. Next slide, please. And taking a look at nickel trade data, Sarah mentioned we have 2021 is the most recent year we have full global trade data. But you see in terms of imports, China is the largest importer of unprocessed and refined nickel. Of course, a lot of this is going into steel. It's not all batteries, but China is the major producer of both steel and chemicals and feed for lithium-ion batteries. And on the export side, you see the Philippines as showing up as one of the largest exporters of unprocessed nickel ores and concentrates. And you notice that Indonesia has been one of the largest producers of miners of nickel. They're not on the export graph at all, and that's because we mentioned before they banned all exports of the nickel ores and concentrates to keep it within their country and develop their supply chains internally. Next slide, please. I just want to cover some of the recent developments of interest for nickel. First, in the United States, as others have mentioned, the government is targeting lot of all the battery minerals, but nickel too for improving U.S. Production capabilities for lithium-ion batteries in particular. Nickel in 2022, nickel it was not initially part of this the critical mineral list that the USGS had developed, but it was added last year after further analysis, and kind of the realization was that we have basically one domestic supply source, and there's expected to be a lot of growth in demand. So there's a single point of failure potential here. And so nickel was added to that, and that puts it in the same ballpark as the other critical minerals. And then of interest was in the bipartisan infrastructure law that last year, some funding was released for a new company called Talon Metals. They're in the process of developing a new mine, nickel mine in Minnesota, and they also have funding for a processing facility in North Dakota to support the mining operations, and they've already locked up, from what I understand, an agreement with Tesla to supply a fairly significant amount of nickel to Tesla. So there are possibilities for domestic sources of nickel in the works. And the other thing for the U.S. and also on a global basis, the adoption of different battery chemistries will be important for nickel and cobalt too, of course, because the lithium iron phosphate battery technologies that are becoming more prominent and seem to be gaining some steam that would impact the nickel usage in the future, because that's the battery chemistry that doesn't incorporate any nickel or cobalt, and that would be, take a dent out of the nickel consumption for batteries. But I think most expectations are that there's going to be there's going to be applications that use all the different battery chemistries in the near future. So I haven't seen anything saying that the nickel usage won't continue to grow. Just a question of how much is going to be needed. On a global basis, Indonesia is just the epicenter right now of nickel. They've made huge efforts they've taken advantage of the resources they have, and they've just made a lot of efforts to build up their downstream capabilities, and this has attracted primarily Chinese investment in Indonesia. So you have a lot of joint ventures and Chinese firms getting involved, and the number of nickel smelters in Indonesia to process nickel has grown from 13 in 2020 to what's expected to be 30 operating by 2024. And you see the value, even last year, the value of the nickel exported from Indonesia just grew exponentially from 2017. That's just because of they're exporting more value-added products. So, looking at some of the other things going on, there's new projects focused on producing intermediates for batteries. We have a lot of deals with electric vehicle producers interested in setting up shop near the resources, like in Indonesia. Volkswagen, Tesla, Toyota, Mitsubishi, and Honda have all reportedly committed to building electric vehicle factories in Indonesia. There's also battery producers that are involved in those developments. And then the Russia-Ukraine conflict sent nickel prices skyrocketing last year, and it's come down a little bit, but it's an issue because Russia accounts for about 20% of the high-grade nickel, class 1 nickel, and so a lot of companies have stopped using that nickel, so it's essentially not available to a lot of the market participants. And then we have a lot of other developments going on a global basis for new nickel sources in places like Australia, Canada, Philippines, and New Caledonia, Brazil, and Madagascar. And so with that, I will stop and I'll have some time for questions.
Thanks, David. That's a really interesting presentation. And I think your differentiation between class 1 and class 2 nickel, you broke that out for everybody. I think that's really helpful. Folks really understanding the different supply chains for the different types of nickel, depending on which deposit they come from. One question I have when we're thinking about the different nickel deposits and looking at the laterite deposits, is there a different environmental footprint in converting those deposits into battery grade materials than there would be using class 1 nickel from, say, Canada or another country? Can you kind of give us a little more flavor for how that environmental footprint differs among the products?
Yeah, I mean, this is becoming a pretty big issue, especially for the electric vehicle manufacturers who are interested in minimizing the environmental footprint, the global footprint of the vehicles that are being used. And then you have the extraction process that's associated with the nickel laterite deposits is a lot more energy and carbon intensive than the sulfide nickel deposits. I think on average, it can be up to 6 times more carbon intensive to extract nickel from laterite deposits, and a lot of it's partially because of the grade is much lower than the sulfide deposit, so you're going to have to process a lot more ore to get this, the same amount of end product. So that's one of the drawbacks to it, I guess you would say. And then in Indonesia, where a lot of the nickel processing is going on, their electricity is reliant on coal. It's fueled by coal production, coal power plants, and so a lot of the electricity used to process the nickel in Indonesia is running off fossil fuels, and it requires a lot of energy. Along with that, a lot of the processes that they're using to generate intermediate products from laterites, the intermediate nickel products that can be used in lithium-ion batteries, they use a high-pressure acid leaching process that requires a lot of water. It generates a lot of waste, and there's a lot of issues with storage of the waste that's generated from this process. At one point, some of it was being dumped, dumped at sea. I think they've stopped that in Indonesia, but it's an energy-intensive process to prepare the waste for safe storage. The other issue is a lot of these laterite deposits are in these subtropical regions like Indonesia and Philippines that have rainforests, and they're considered biodiversity hotspots. And to get to the nickel, you're doing strip mining. It's not a underground, invisible type process to the people in these areas. It's a strip mine, and so there's deforestation issues associated with producing nickel from these deposits. So that's yet another environmental concern. And then you also have coral reefs in those areas, so the sediment that's discharged from these mining operations is a potential hazard if it bleeds into these coral reefs. So yeah, it's definitely an issue of concern that will need to be addressed, definitely, especially as the mine production grows.
So an even more complicated environmental story. So thank you for that,
Yeah,
David.
you're solving one problem and creating another potentially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much. To round out our conversation, we bring in Carl Tsuji, who has had a distinguished career focused on metals as international trade analyst at the ITC, and he's going to talk about graphite. Take it away. You're on mute, Carl.
Okay, let me turn my microphone on. Thank you, Adina.
Yeah.
Now we'll shift the focus to the anode side of the lithium-ion cell. Graphite is readily available. It's the most commonly occurring crystalline form of carbon, and it offers the critical performance characteristics for the anode material across a wide range of battery types, going all the way back to the zinc alkaline batteries, which were discovered and developed going back to the 19th century. Now, you'll note that there are lesser concerns, both in the policy literature as well as minerals processing literature, about graphite availability than for other battery materials, because graphite is not solely restricted to natural sources. Artificial graphite can be manufactured from residual carbonaceous materials, calcined petroleum coke from refining of crude petroleum, and coal tar pitch recovered from the coking of metallurgical coal. So battery anode manufacturers can select either one of these types of graphite for its specific advantages, or can blend them together in various proportions for the combined advantages. Next slide. here you see the flow diagram for graphite. At the upper third, you'll see the mining and processing of natural graphite. In the lower 2/3, you'll see the recovery and processing for artificial graphite. As well as the major countries that are participating at each stage of the global value chain. First of all, notice that China has prominence in every stage of the graphite global value chain, particularly for mining of natural graphite, which is a similar story for other battery materials. However, unlike many other materials, the United States is prominent in the raw material inputs for artificial graphite. It's the largest producer of calcined petroleum coke and a major producer of coal tar pitch. Japan and Korea, they're prominent as processors of natural graphite, even though they don't mine the graphite. And ultimately, China, Japan, Korea, the United States, and Western Europe are major participants as producers of artificial graphite and processors of graphite into battery anode materials. A key takeaway is the prominence along the graphite global supply chain is reflected in the global trade trends. Next slide. When we look at the global producers of graphite, for natural graphite, you'll see China as the long-standing world's largest producer. But there are some newcomers as well, both Mozambique and Madagascar. For petroleum coke, the United States, the largest producer, and it's also a major producer of coal tar pitch. Both of these are the raw material inputs for artificial graphite. China's the second largest producer of petroleum coke, and calcined petroleum coke, and a leading coal tar pitch producer. India is the third largest producer of calcined petroleum coke, although it produces the coke primarily as a fuel. Now, unfortunately, similar statistics are not readily available for coal tar and for the battery carbons. Next slide. Here are the consumption end uses by shares for both natural graphite on the left and artificial graphite on the right. Batteries are the second largest end use application for both types of graphite, exceeded only by electrodes for artificial graphite there on the right, and refractories for natural graphite there on the left. The key takeaways: the batteries share across both types of graphite has increased from 9% worldwide in 2016 to 17% in 2021. Nevertheless, graphite price formation is driven more by the metals, nuclear, automotive, and other industries rather than by EV battery manufacturing. Next slide. Here we can see the trade stats. On the left are the exports. On the right, you see the imports there, and the bars are in the same order, starting at the top with natural graphite. Note that China, the world's predominant producer, is also the predominant exporter of natural graphite, but also re-imports processed natural graphite being supplied that they had supplied to Japan and South Korea. Japan, South Korea, and the United States and Germany are major natural graphite consumers, hence they're major importers, but they lack the domestic mined production. Calcined petroleum coke, the second lines there on both graphs. The United States and China are the world's largest producers and exporters. India is a major producer, but also a predominant importer because its domestic production of calcined petroleum coke is insufficient to meet its domestic consumption needs, particularly as an industrial fuel. Coal tar pitch there on the third line. China's the world's predominant producer and exporter. The import side is more muddled, with South Korea, Russia, Norway, and Qatar as the leading importers. And it's because coal tar pitch has a wide range of industrial end uses. Finally, the bottom lines for artificial graphite, China, Japan, and South Korea are the predominant major producers and exporters. And then on the right-hand side, you see that South Korea, the United States, and China are also major importers. Now, it should be noted that these 6-digit harmonized system classifications are rather comprehensive, cover across these materials in to varying degrees of processing. Next slide. Recent developments. Due to concerns about China's predominance for production of natural graphite, there are extensive efforts underway to develop mined graphite resources outside of China, particularly Australia, North America, Scandinavia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as the movement downstream along the global value chain of raw materials producers. So for example, Australian and Canadian natural graphite mining firms into processing of graphite, and in India, coal tar producers to production of artificial graphite. Development of alternative anode materials. There are some advanced materials, silicon and silicon carbon, are in stages of initial production, whereas graphene's a highly reformed, highly formulated and refined form of graphite is still under development. There are a number of projects being funded by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law for silicon production, new facilities in Fremont and Santa Clara in the Bay Area of California, for silicon and silicon carbon materials in Moses Lake, Washington. Finally, there is also support for graphite processing and manufacturing with both new and expanded facilities in the United States for natural graphite, Vidalia, Louisiana, and for artificial graphite, facilities in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and Sanborn, New York. And we still have time for some questions.
Thanks, Carl. That was a really interesting presentation. And I think as with nickel, I think there's the distinction between artificial and natural graphite is not well enough understood and covered in the different supply sources for the materials for batteries. So great, you appreciate that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Carl, I have 1 or 2 questions for you, and then I'm going to kind of open up questions to the panel. I know we've got a lot of questions coming in, and we have some more questions we want to ask. So we'll see what we can get to the next 15 minutes. So before we turn to kind of questions for the panel, Carl, can you talk a little bit more? You mentioned a little bit more at the end about the efforts to develop natural graphite mining and processing in other countries outside of China. With the Inflation Reduction Act, there's certainly a lot of interest in getting those from FTA partner countries. Can you talk a little bit more about the activities that are happening in FTA partner countries as far as natural graphite mining and processing, development of those resources happening in FTA partner countries?
Yes, and yes, to be brief, there's mining and mineral exploration ongoing, as well as initial development of mine sites, primarily in Canada, particularly the provinces of Ontario and in Quebec. There's also activity in the United States. I would recommend those who are interested in further details, as well as to see my May 2021 graphite working paper. It's available on the USITC's publications webpage. There are country case studies in the natural graphite section, and in the appendices, there's a list of mined graphite producers worldwide.
Thanks, Carl. And just turning to the artificial graphite for a minute, you had mentioned that one of the downsides was the higher production costs. Are there ways to reduce that production costs? Can we see that being more price competitive in the near term, or is that just kind of naturally a higher price product?
Well, it literally boils down to the cost of electricity. The process for artificial graphite, it's a recrystallization of either needle coke or what's called pitch coke, but it's highly energy intensive and time consuming. The coke crystals have to be heated in an electric induction furnace for 4 to 5 months to recrystallize these prismatic crystals into the flat tabular graphite crystals. So unfortunately, the technology is not available to speed up the process, either for the recrystallization of needle coke or pitch coke into natural graphite, or for preparing these raw materials from calcined petroleum coke or coal tar pitch, respectively. So to reduce the cost, you will need cheaper electricity sources, say hydropower, or perhaps solar generated electricity.
Thanks, Carl. That's really interesting. I'm gonna kind of for our next question, kind of go back to earlier in the presentation, jump back to lithium. Lithium certainly seen huge price increases in the last year. Certainly large demand growth. And I know, Anna, you had talked a little bit about the change, these new technologies that might be available, the direct lithium extraction, things like that. Can you talk a little bit more about those technologies, how close they are to commercialization, whether in this high price environment, we think they'll be able to commercialize production using those technologies? So if you could take us a little bit more through what the prospects are, that would be great.
Yeah, definitely. So direct lithium extraction, it's kind of being viewed as a trifecta in potentially advancing lithium production, because it has the ability to yield about twice as much in some of the technologies, as twice as much from the same deposit on a much quicker timetable. So for brine extraction from the sun, it can take months to years, and this is on the scale of hours. So a much quicker timetable, and then a much smaller environmental footprint, both with land use and with emissions and water use. So there are 5 major forms of DLE right now, and there's one that is actually commercially in place, and that is in South America, and it's called absorbent DLE, but it recovers about 80 to 99% of the lithium from the brine extraction, whereas some of the 4 other forms of DLE being explored could recover essentially all of it. So that has a lot of potential. Some of the potential skepticism, I guess, is there are Albemarle executives who note that they believe that in the short term, they're more skeptical of viability, because the DLE has to be tailored specifically to each deposit, which would make scalability an issue. And that's partly why there's so many different forms of DLE technology under development right now. And one really cool one that I'll note, the Department of Energy is funding research in the Salton Sea, taking advantage of existing geothermal energy production there to potentially extract lithium from the brine that's already being pumped before returning the brine to the groundwater. So Controlled Thermal Resources is one of the companies in that space in the Salton Sea. And General Motors is betting pretty big on the commercial viability of it because they've secured rights to about 20,000 tons of lithium hydroxide annually from that process. So overall, I'd say there's a lot more promise than barriers to commercialization.
That's really interesting. It'd be really interesting to see if we can bring some of these other technologies online. And that kind of segues into my next question, which was, you know, when we're looking at lithium, you mentioned there's the one mine in the US. To what extent is there growth in mine production? And I guess also the downstream chemicals production as well, whether from US or from imported materials.
Yeah. So currently the US is about less than 1% of global lithium production right now. And it's that one mine in Silver Peak, Nevada. In Albemarle, it's the world's largest lithium producer, a US based company. It expects to double production there by 2025, but it's maybe 10,000 tons of lithium carbonate equivalent. So relatively small portion of global supply that would be from that specific mine. However, in the Salton Sea, the DOE is estimating that we might see 600,000 tons produced annually. That's kind of a far out. Those are initial estimates, so take it with a grain of salt. But for context, that 600,000, the amount supplied last year of equivalent was, a little bit less than that. So as we see demand increase, there's a lot of potential for the US to supply a portion of that. And the other major site that you see a lot of articles about is Thacker Pass in Nevada. And Lithium Americas is working on construction this year. And at full capacity, that would supply another 80,000 tons. But in terms of downstream processing, I'll get to quickly. There are quite a few processing facilities slated to open up in the Southeast US. So Tesla just started construction on a plant in Corpus Christi, Texas, that would be some lithium hydroxide processing, as well as several in North Carolina and Tennessee that Piedmont Lithium is expecting to bring, I think, about 90,000 tons of lithium carbonate equivalent from its two facilities planned in Tennessee and North Carolina. So we are domestically working on getting there. It's just the matter of when things tend to get delayed. So, if they say 2025, it might be a few years down the road.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And I know we're getting close on time. There's lots of questions. We're not going to get to everything. So I'm just going to wrap up with one kind of question for Sarah, kind of overarching all this and so much this demand for minerals. Can you talk about LFP? And we've seen a lot of growth in LFP. What's kind of driving that growth? And do we expect to see kind of continued growth and use of LFP? Do we expect to see that to come into the United States more and more cars being built with LFP technology? Anyway, if you can give us a sense for that, because I think that's really going to affect how some of the demand for some of these minerals like nickel and cobalt kind of evolve over the near to long term.
You did. So yeah, we're seeing increasing diversification in battery chemicals across electric car models, and with differing chemistries being used based on price and driving range and performance needs, just like any other car. But in a nutshell, LFPs are cheaper. For example, the average cost of an LFP is $90 per kilowatt hours, whereas the NMC, the lithium, nickel, manganese, and cobalt, and the NCA, which is the lithium, nickel, cobalt, are about $130 per kilowatt hour. So the NMCs and the NCAs have better energy density, which means that they have a longer driving range. They also have better cold weather performance, but since they're more expensive, that puts the LFP as emerging as a lower cost battery type to fill a demand for lower upfront price tag for the smaller and entry level EVs. Because unlike the NMCs and the NCAs, LFP batteries don't contain the nickel, cobalt, and manganese, which results in the cheaper manufacturing costs.
Thank you, Sarah, for that. I think it's an interesting point to think about the economics. Certainly cheaper batteries means greater uptake, but it also could alter the economics for recycling of batteries too. So something I think for all of us to consider, going forward. So I just want to thank you, Sarah, and the entire team, Anna, Kristen, David, Carl, for taking the time to be with us today. Thank you for your public service and for sharing your incredible expertise with all of us. So now I expect every person in the audience and who have tuned in to start searching the ITC publications webpage for studies on a range of trade and industry information that I think will help hopefully lead all of us to some solid policy ideas and solutions going forward. And thanks, of course, to my colleague, Andy, for facilitating this engagement with the ITC. And I hope everybody has a great day. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.